We're going to do this a little bit of a paired conversation about building to scale. But before we jump right into it, we kind of want to get an idea of what everyone's looking like and kind of what companies you guys are all coming from. So it's going to be a quick show of hands just on are we A or B, and then like finance or non-finance, because then we can kind of either get super deep or we can pull out a little bit. So could I just get a show of hands of who's anyone A or seed or pre?
Series A, Series B.
A.
Perfect.
Gotcha. And then B and later, I'm assuming, is everyone else?
Awesome.
Solid. And then who are our finance people here? Okay. And then everyone else non-finance. All right. That's a good split. So when we'll start off, I'll give a brief intro, and then Ron will kind of jump off into the next few slides. My name's Vito Brandle. I've been in the Bay Area for about 10 years. I started over in the Midwest from St. Louis, Missouri, came over to the Bay Area, worked at Yahoo for a few years, joined a finance org over at Brightroll with Ron for about 5 years, and then we wound up getting purchased by Yahoo again, and Ron will speak a little bit to that facet later on. And now I run finance at a company called Quri, where we do retail intelligence for CPG companies. So, Ron?
Yep. So my name is Ron Will. I was the CFO of Brightroll, which was a true company. They were actually our first check. Before that, I spent 12 years in investment banking in New York and here in the Bay Area. I actually participated in some of the silliness in the first bubble. I then went to Yahoo in a corporate finance position, and then was the treasurer at Yahoo. I showed up at Brightroll. We were about 100 people, and I'll talk through the kind of situation there. Worked there for 4 years with Vito. We sold to Yahoo, ironically. Then I spent a little bit of time at a private equity firm, and then I went to TubeMogul, which was a competitor to Brightroll, public company out here in Emeryville. And 6 months later, we sold to Adobe. So I've seen a fair bit of sales of ad tech companies. And what we're going to talk about is just working through how do you build for scale in the G&A organization. And I started really in finance at Yahoo, and I was lucky enough to work in a team that was extremely strategic. We were about a half dozen investment bankers that worked directly for the CFO of Yahoo, Sue Decker at the time. To give you a sense, she was the head of research at DLJ, which was an investment bank back in the 90s and 80s. She's on the board of Berkshire Hathaway, Costco, Intel. She's probably the most analytical person I've ever met. And we worked on large-scale projects, everything from every acquisition that Yahoo worked on to every data center investment they made. I ran capital markets, so that means we did about $7 billion a share repurchase. And then I transitioned into treasury, and treasury is incredibly tactical. We had 350 entities, legal entities. We had hundreds of bank accounts. We had it was the exact opposite of being strategic. You just had to move money from one part of the organization to the other. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how and why are certain groups viewed strategically within an organization, and why are other teams viewed incredibly tactically. And when I showed up at Brightroll, the situation was we were about 100 employees. We were running on an old version of QuickBooks that was sitting in a closet somewhere. We took about 30 to 40 days to close our books. Finance was viewed as a bunch of bookkeepers. And we really were a silo of information that no one in the organization was using. And it really forced me to think about, like, how do you create a team and create the environment so that people can be viewed strategically and really be part of helping the company be successful, because that's the job I wanted. And it was really a bit of a journey, as all these things are, particularly at startups. And I'm just going to walk through some of the steps that we took, and then some of the outputs that we had that I thought really made a difference. And then we can talk about, and all during this, if you have any questions, please just yell them out. Happy to answer anything. So for those that don't know, real quickly, Brightroll was a video ad platform. When I got there, we were a video ad network. and we had a small business called the Bright Roll Exchange. Within 2 to 3 years, we had built out a pretty impressive technology platform that created a tremendous amount of complexity for the finance organization, the legal team that we ended up building. And it was really important for us to have a handle on all that. And we could see that very early on that was going to be quite a challenge. If you're not familiar to what G&A does, G&A has a variety of functions. Everything from the tactical, making sure you get your payroll, making sure an invoice goes out, make sure an invoice gets paid. It's responsible for legal compliance, for making sure your articles of incorporation are correct, making sure that people are getting options that are okay. It's responsible for budgeting, and in our organization, it was responsible for real estate, facilities, and just general operations. And the question for me as I walked in, I had pretty much a whiteboard. I knew, and I'll be blunt, I knew I was going to blow up the team, and it was just a question of how quick. We had to do a fundraising. We had to really get things in order quickly to do a fundraising, as I'm sure most of you know. I sat back and had one of those nights where you're like, oh crap, how are we going to get this done? And really forced me to think about how am I going to build this team very quickly. The first thing I did was hire Vito, which made my life much easier, obviously, for the next four years. And Vito was a case study in how I wanted to start hiring going forward. I wanted people across the organization, because I was starting from scratch, who were folks who could get things done, but also had a vision for how their organizations would work, and had a vision for what the steps very clearly were required to get there. So to give you some examples, we very early on built up some core competency in accounting because we needed to go through an ERP change. I hired a public company controller. It was a small public company, but still he knew what the vision was. I hired a general counsel fairly early on. Happy to talk about that. A lot of people were like, why? It turned out to be a great decision. We had a lot of contract complexity. We had a lot of training that had to be done as we expanded into new businesses. We had a lot of compliance issues. We really drilled down on making sure we had the right people around the table. The second thing we did, we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we give those people leverage, and how can we get the data that we were all using to be clean. So we spent, first thing we hit was making sure the Salesforce data was correct, and what is correct. We had a lot of fun discussions around that. The second thing, we actually used Great Plains. I highly don't recommend that, if that's a phrase. Great Plains was a disaster. We regretted it from day one. Now, obviously, you'd use NetSuite, and that's pretty much the standard. We put in things like much early on than a lot of folks recognize, like Adaptive Insights, which is a budgeting software. And as we'll talk about later on, we really wanted to make sure that people on the finance team were able to get some leverage. So we made sure they had tools. CLM Matrix is a contract management system. We put that on very early. We were able to run the entire organization, give you a sense of scale. We had over 200 million in revenue. We had one general counsel, was our only in-house lawyer for quite a while. And because of things like contract management systems, she was able to keep a tremendous amount organized and efficient. And it was very late on that we hired our next lawyer. We talked about Adaptive on the budgeting. We'll spend some time there, but my recommendation on a lot of these things is to push the G&A department to have the same sort of rigor that you'd expect from your product and engineering organizations, and don't leave it up to by organic means that they'll end up in the right place. And so regardless of what, if you're the CEO, if you're the COO, really make sure that finance is both staffed correctly and resourced correctly as far as the type of software they're using, and provide a lot of feedback at an early stage. When I got there was a laundry list of things that were wrong. We were doing options manually. We were doing, obviously, budgeting all through Excel. We were doing, contracts were scattered around the organization. We had 6 offices, and we had contracts shoved in people's desks, printed out. We didn't even have soft copies of things. It was the classic mess. And just some basic rigor around a lot of these things was really important at an early stage. And then to get to some of the more interesting stuff, once we had the right people around the table and we had the right systems in place, how were we able to use a lot of these things? So I'm going to walk through. Vito, you want to jump in on this?
Sure. And then one thing I actually want to hit on, well, obviously, first off, if anyone has any questions, throw them out. There's a lot of things that we went through in kind of the first 4 or 5 years we were over at Brightroll, but happy to kind of take whatever punches you have on questions that are actually affecting your company. One thing I want to bring back up is what Ron was saying about, okay, how are we actually being strategic and how are we moving our teams forward? So it's very easy as we're thinking about hiring product or engineers or people in marketing. We're like, oh, we want all the right people on the bus, right? We want all the A players in there. But what happens a lot in G&A is you'll hire all those A players and then you'll just sit them in a closet doing work or executing rather than actually thinking strategically, which is kind of everything that Ron knew a lot about it beforehand. I wound up learning a lot of it during the Brightroll journey. So,
and one example is, how many people here know what the close process is in finance? Close process is the way you get to, you pull your books together. We had a close process when I showed up at Brightroll that was over 30 days every single month. So picture that. That means
probably over 45 days.
It was. We don't like to admit that. We never told True that, but that's a fact. And we were going through a fundraising at the same time. And the reason was we didn't have the right people. We didn't have the right systems. And we really hadn't been strategic about applying those things as key parts of the close process. So an example is, it would take us close to 2 weeks to close revenue. So just picture you're running a startup and you have absolutely no idea how GAAP revenue is coming in every single month until 40 days later. So nature hates the vacuum. What ends up happening? You use what's in Salesforce. You use some other metric to track what is sales and what is revenue. So picture now you roll forward a couple of months or quarters or years with that kind of vacuum. And that's how you end up with finance being viewed non-strategically as an organization, as a group. And that just continues. And so, focus on some of the real tactical parts of the accounting process, of the FP&A process, which we'll walk through, was really important at the early stages to make sure that we could be a partner for the organization with some timely and accurate information so that people started trusting us. The last thing you want to do is say, like, well, what is revenue? And get into these philosophical conversations about revenue. We had to get to a point where we all agreed what revenue was, and we can actually focus on driving more revenue. When I got to Brightroll, it was what is revenue. It was a real situation as a finance person that really puts you on your back foot. And so the first thing we focused on was getting the close, for example, down to something like 20 days. And of that close, I wanted revenue closed within a week or so that a week after a quarter ended, we could tell people this is how the quarter ended up, at least from revenue. And then we worked on gross profit, and then we worked our way down the income statement. It's a whole bunch of other things that it takes to close the books, stock-based compensation, deferrals, all sorts of other accounting minutia. They're important, but you really wanted to make sure that you had some data to share with the business on a timely basis to make sure that you could actually be viewed as a partner. And if you talk to most finance departments about why they're not strategic, it's because they're spending all their time on this tactical, operational activities, closing the books, everything, all the processes are manual, Excel-based process. They're just taking data and trying to get it in rows and columns in some fashion. And by then, the business, especially at an early stage company, has kind of moved on. We've used some other piece of data to make a decision. Have a nice day. I don't care what happened last quarter. And so it was like, how do you break that cycle? You break that cycle by just speeding up the close for me. And then once the close was cleaned up, then we could then say, all right, how can we provide some analytics on what happened? But it was literally at that stage. We went through a fundraising. We had never been audited. We were a Series D company, had over 100 employees. We were looking to raise, kind of comical now, but in 2011, we were looking to raise $20 million, and it was tough. And the reason it was tough was because we had to put together all this information by hand. And then as the fundraising dragged out, it was updating that information. We would have to go through, and Vito vividly remembers, we would sit in a conference room with multiple spreadsheets and just start adding columns to get things to tie out. And the team went through that on a monthly basis for, I'd say, at least 6 months before we got things cleaned up. But once we did that, first of all, we all knew the income statement backwards and forwards. We knew the cost structure, we knew the revenue of the company. But then at that point, we finally were like, okay, we're all clear on what's going on at this company. We can now start really leaning into the business. So with that.
Yeah, yeah. And it all comes back to leveraging every employee in your company, right? Not just your front end people that get to deal with sales or get to talk to the external folks. It's every employee, even the G&A folks as well. So as Ron mentioned, a lot of that focus when we first came in was, okay, how do we get strategic? Well, we first get strategic by getting everyone looking at the numbers and actually start tracking that numbers, right? We see a lot of information nowadays talking about like, okay, we want to be the data repository, and it's usually outward focused. So being the data repository for our clients. What was important here was, okay, we have so much internal data, we need to be the data repository for our internal company. And G&A is actually well focused to kind of be that central idea across the entire company because they're always thinking about the company in mind. So a few of the areas that we actually really jumped into was early on. Ron was mentioning we were going through this fundraising. It was my first month, maybe 6 months in for Ron. And we had to put all this data together in order to be able to speak intelligently about the company and also just be able to show diligence, be able to kind of have a conversation both internally and with investors. So we took different areas across either like the overall company, focusing on maybe a North Star or main metric to focus the company around, just so everyone knows this is the one metric we want to push. Obviously looking at headcount. So we're not only just looking at, what's P&L, we're looking at what's the top line headcount, what's the attrition, how is the company actually healthy or struggling in certain areas. We had a bunch of financial ones as well that we tracked on a monthly basis just to ensure that we knew very quickly, particularly with that increased close, we knew when things were going wrong. And that's probably one of the most important things when you're a smaller company, when you're a startup, you want to know when things are kind of going off the tracks a little bit so that you can get them back online. So a lot of this is all about the kind of putting the bumpers up. I use the example a lot of, you ever been to a bowling alley and you've seen a bunch of 3-year-olds kind of like throwing the bowling ball down the alley? Like, we'll put those bumpers up. You don't really care how it gets to the end. You just want to make sure it gets to the pins. And then you just have kind of a little buffer on each side. A few of the other items on operational dashboard that we kind of created were also outside of the finance, which is probably a little non-traditional, but these were actually housed within finance, and finance had the ownership of it. And the benefit we got from that was you kind of have your one source of truth, right? So everyone knew, I will come to the dashboard, I don't have to pull my own data. I don't have to go to Salesforce. I don't have to worry about anything else. I know where I'm getting the data from. Everyone gets the same data. And we know that if there's any issues or if there's anyone updating it, it's one group, one person that owns it all, and one person that drives that forward. So we always had a driving function rather than having 30 cooks in the kitchen. We had one person always pushing forward. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit later on as we get into kind of like sales efficiency, sales quotas, and so forth. But that was a pretty large section of that. Speaking of sales quotas. All right, so one of the things we're going to touch on, so as Ron mentioned, all about how to make your G&A team actually strategic versus just transactional. A few of the examples we'll hit on now are kind of how we did that at Brightwell, how we started changing things away from let me just execute to let me be a lever for the team that I'm helping, or let me be kind of the acceleration that's necessary. The reason we put this photo up here is a lot of the times when we would work with sales teams, and I'm sure you guys have familiarity with this as well, is you'll have a sales leader that comes in and is like, oh, I know exactly what my next quarter is going to be. It's going to be this. And you're like, well, how'd you come up with that? They're like, wow, Salesforce. Everything's got to be perfect. Everything's accurate. It's going to be 30 million next year, no problem. And they don't really want the help from finance, right? They don't want any of the other metrics. They're doing well enough as it is. they don't really see the need in kind of being leashed, right? They just want to go out, they want to sell, they want to be done with stuff. But there are ways that the finance and the G&A team can actually help lever up and assist on the sales side. And so this is how we structured it over at Brightwell, was to not only focus the kind of what the sales side was looking at, and they were looking at whether it be renewals or pipeline or how even Salesforce itself forecasts it. We were able to kind of give them that next level. So we gave them that next level through all of these other metrics that we were seeing across the company that they just don't necessarily have the time to dig into, don't have the time to lever, don't even have the time to really get into a buy rep type of metric. Whereas on the finance side, we're obviously focused on month-end close, quarter-end close, but the sales team, they're only focused on quarter-end close. And if they're having to figure out a quota for the very next quarter while trying to close, you're putting their mindset and their incentives in the wrong way. We want them focusing on the close, and we want to be able to help as quick or as much as we can in order to provide a accurate quota and a good forecast for the next quarter, just so that they don't have to worry about it, and we're not getting 3 weeks into the next quarter without any type of process. So
yeah, I think another thing, because of my background, there were a whole host of data points that I felt like weren't being included in the process. And so one example is how are our competitors doing? We had a host of companies that had gone public in our sector. We had large companies that disclosed quite a bit of information in earnings calls. So we were very diligent about tracking all these data points within the finance organization, partially because we wanted to go through, as I'll talk about later, public company readiness. Maybe we want to go public. But partially also to just start making sure that people realize there were going to be other metrics of importance that they needed to consider as they're building out their team. So that's great that you're growing at 60%, but our top 3 competitors are all growing at 80%. And why? It's very easy for an internal team when they're setting incentives to look at just what is in the pipeline, what happened last quarter, and default to that, particularly as Vito mentioned, at the end of a quarter when people are just 100% focused and then the quota process got a little weak. And let's not forget, for us, it was a tremendous percentage as a direct sales portion of our business. There's a tremendous percentage of our operating expenses was on sales commission. So for finance to actually get control of the income statement and operating expenses, we really had to make sure that we were managing sales compensation and that there was some rationale. We knew there was definite metrics out in the marketplace that we would have to be judged by in the future when we went public, for example. Sales and marketing expense is going to have to be 22% of your income statement, something like that. So how do we get there? And to be honest, the first couple of conversations, they don't go great. And you're throwing in a lot of factors that a head of sales may turn around and be like, I've never had to do this before. But the reality is, I can tell you, is by the time you go public, if you go public, or later stages of the company, those are the type of metrics that actually start really mattering. And it's more about a diligence to the cadence and what kind of data is going to be involved there, and making sure that people in the organization start thinking about some of these other factors earlier on that we found was helpful.
Yeah, and you always show up with a point of view, but it's not a guess point of view. Like we use a triangulation approach on pretty much every conversation we had with other departments to ensure that when we were coming to them with what our estimate was on a per rep goal, a regional goal, a overall goal, like there was data behind that. There was more than one way that we got to that number, and then we can have that starting conversation. Before we jump into the next example, sales quotas, it's a relatively large topic. Any questions from the crowd on how you're dealing with sales quotas in your companies, or how it's being handled moving forward?
Or just hit us afterwards. We're here. So
Sounds good.
Why don't we talk about budgeting and planning? I had this vision of what budgeting and planning should be, and then you go to a startup and you see what it is. And the typical startup budgeting process runs something like this. The final output, let's start with, is a one-page Excel sheet with a couple of columns for every quarter. It's got limited granularity, and everyone kind of files it away after you present it to the board. A couple of executives are focused on it, but the rest of the organization is kind of like, yeah, whatever. There's all these factors that we're not going to consider. Intergroup interdependencies are never talked about. So sales wants to expand internationally, and marketing didn't even know about it. The engineering guys find out about this in some meeting 6 months later. The board gets a spreadsheet and then has to spend all this time figuring out, like, what does this really mean? So there's no strategy behind the budgeting process or kind of independent process points. Every time you have to onboard someone in the finance department, you had this big issue of like explaining the background of the budget and the granularity of the budget. So there are all these issues, and I couldn't believe that companies were getting, like, to me, because I came from such an Excel mindset, I just said, how do you expect people to be able to execute over the course of the year when the only data point they get from finance is this one pager? Like, this tells me nothing. And so I had this vision of what I wanted, and then the question was kind of how we got there. And where I wanted was this. And this was our annual budget that we would provide to the board, to our execs, to our teams. And we ended up providing it to Yahoo, and it kind of simplified the whole process. And what it was a one-page strategy assessment and strategy for the company. And then we walked through every single line of business. We walked through every single expense item. We ran scenarios on this. And so we'll talk a little bit about how did we get here, right? How could you, and some folks saw the value in this, and other folks, I'll be quite honest, were like, why? But there were a lot of advantages in some of the issues that I talked about, making sure groups were coordinated, making sure the board had a very clear picture of what our budget was, making sure, and Vito will walk through the process, but just real quickly, to the earlier slides, we needed people who had a vision of kind of where this thing was going. We needed a software platform that allowed us to do this in a rapid fashion. You're not doing this in Excel, I'll tell you that. And we needed to have coordination amongst the entire organization. We also needed to be able to drive a tight process. We provided this to the board first week of December. And the reason we were able to do this is some of the earlier things I talked about. We started early because we knew where we wanted to end up. We had software systems, we had people, and finance drove this entire process. Finance came with a starting point, went out to each team, worked with each team as a business partner, provided the software package. So we'll just quickly run through this.
Yeah, I still remember that conversation really well. Probably within the first couple of months of me being at Brightroll, and Ron's like, this is what I want to provide the board. And I was probably thinking the same thing you guys were thinking, like, shit, that's going to be a lot of work. And we had to basically scramble because at that point, I was thinking from an Excel mindset. I was thinking, okay, I will have the sweetest looking model in Excel. It will do everything it needs to be. Just, I hope that no one else adds any type of variables to it, because then it's all going to break down and I'll have to try to fix it again. So the way that we got to this point was by a lot of adding the systems in and just adding in the ability to talk through and kind of have that internal structure within the team. We used Adaptive pretty heavily for this process in order to turnkey this very quickly. So we would be able to absolutely change the scenario, change the budget, and get one of these out in a day, if that. And that's mostly just because Adaptive has pretty good inclusions into both Word and PowerPoint, where we can just come in, it flips in the numbers, it flips in a good amount of the overall kind of content in there as well, and you're able to put this in.
And the key point here is, if finance can do that in a day, once you get everything set up, you can spend your time actually focusing on making sure that you're allocating resources around the organization where they belong, which is the point of the budgeting process. The point of the budgeting process is not an Excel exam. And so we wanted to make sure that people in finance had a very simple way to spend their time effectively. This also made budget reconciliation as we went through the year, every single month. What'd that take? Like an hour?
Yeah.
Hour and a half? we'd run budget recons at the end of each month. So I don't want this to be a product pitch, but implementing things like this allow the finance team to really lean in and help drive a strategy discussion and making sure people were focused on, because we could meet with the sales team would rework how they were thinking about go-to-market for our 3 lines of business, and then we could turn it around by the next morning without any issue. And we could do that with every single team, and at the same time we could produce this for teams around the company. All the execs could have a copy as it was flowing. And so they had a very clear picture of what is sales saying, what is marketing saying, the engineering team, the product team, and they could start thinking, like, what does that mean for me? I need to build out a training team because I didn't realize that this was happening. I didn't realize we were going to have 4 sales events, so marketing has to boost their budget. It just allowed us to get much more robust in the process, as opposed to, okay, we're going to be able to turn this giant Excel model. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Right? And so the cadence of this sped up and allowed us to really focus on making sure that people thought about all the issues, and meanwhile the exec team could really focus on the strategy behind it and not worry about, okay, how long is it going to take to turn this? And also it allowed us to bake in constraints. So if anyone hasn't read it, there's a great blog post by Ben Horowitz, which I completely agree with, about the only way to do budgeting is constraints. Pick some item, free cash flow positive, profitable, EBITDA positive, cash balance greater than $10 million at the end of the year, whatever it is, and then drive toward that. With a software system like this, you were able to do that. You know, what is that going to mean for a given metric? And we could just keep churning it. So, oh, engineering wants to increase hiring by 45% next year. Okay, what's that going to do to our model? And you know, we could view it in various parameters. So we could pick a metric and we could see what was happening, and we'd keep running scenarios until we were able to find that and do that quickly. And that really helped drive a much better budgeting process for the company and gave people an output that they could say, I have a very clear picture of what we're doing next year, and I have a very clear picture of what my resources are to get that done. And then once all the arguments were done, that's it. We had a budget and we kept moving forward on it. And sure, you're going to course correct and you're going to come to me and say, I need an exception. I underestimated how much this type of person would cost, right? But you could really narrow the amount of exceptions that you had to manage as you went through the year.
Yeah, and to Ron's point, like the name of that game, like having those iterations, they get bought in. You know, the first time that I ever did a budgeting process, particularly at some of the larger companies, you do maybe 1 iteration. Maybe you talk to your business partner maybe twice. They're not bought into that. They don't feel like they're actually having any say in the budget for the next year. Whereas with this process, we went through 4 or 5. We took their feedback. We came back. Like we were able to get them so involved that the next conversations when we were talking about a budget versus actuals or a different strategic aspect, it was just so much easier, and it snapped together so much faster.
So I want to keep an eye on the clock. We've been going for about 40 minutes, but we'll only have time for Q&A. So we'll run through a couple of other examples of some of the type of analysis, because we had folks who were freed up from the close, freed up from all the other kind of tactical activities, churning Excel. They could take a look at, all right, what's the typical pipeline conversion by week? They could start running regression analysis on some of this. They could start spotting salespeople who continually game the Salesforce process, right? I'm gonna dump in a bunch of stuff right after we give out quotas, and the next morning our pipeline would pop up right after we gave out numbers, right? We could start spotting some of those things, really understand our business. We could look at sort of trend analysis by week as well, and we could tie all this to GAAP revenue, which as we started thinking about going public became more and more important, and really driving the entire company on what is revenue, which is an accounting geek concept, I get, but we really, in our industry, what is revenue became extremely important. We were able to run deal reviews. So once you got people who were organized, we made everyone around the company, if you had a deal over a certain size on the sales side, on the BD side, come prepared to talk through, okay, what's that deal going to look like? Have I talked to all the necessary constituents? You know, are there any non-standard terms so legal could get a handle on it? What is the impact to budget? Do you need additional budget? What are the needs of this from the various teams around the organization? Make sure people were coordinated. And then finally, we have early stage companies, mid, later stage companies. Let's just talk real briefly about public company readiness, because it's something we spent over a year on before we got acquired. There are a lot of benefits to going through this process as early as possible. And people say, why? You know, I don't want to deal with SOX, and I don't want to deal with all these other issues. That's not the point. The point is there's a whole host of these activities that are just around company maturity and running your business like a business. And what we did was we picked out those items and we made sure we did those items first. So we could have a credible case for why we're ready to go public in 12 months or not, or in 9 months, or in 6 months. And we were able to report back to the board. We went through this analysis, which looks at what can we get done post-IPO, pre-IPO, what do we have to start working on right now. We went through this a year before we ended up selling the company. It took probably 3 months to pull all this together and make sure that everyone knew. I'm happy to walk through this if someone wants to ping me. But it really helped focus the board on what needed to get done, helped focus the company, helped make sure that as part of everyone's OKRs, which we rolled out earlier, it was part of critical teams' OKRs. So when are we going to change internal IT systems? When are we going to do other things? That reduced a lot of confusion around the company. When are we going public? How are we going public? What does it mean to go public? We were able to really provide a lot of visibility to the organization and the board about, all right, here's our plan, agree, disagree. Once we're signed off, this is what we're rolling on. And as you can tell, we were very specific about when we would file an S1, when would be effective. Luckily, we sold right before that. So just real briefly, what were the advantages of all this? You sold. Like, you never went public. Why'd you bother? One, I would say we were able to be true business partners for the organization. I think we executed better as an organization because of the work that Vito and the finance team did. I think second, we were a much more attractive target for Yahoo. We sold for $640 million. Why did we get that purchase price? We got that because they thought they were acquiring a public company, because we were buttoned up tight. I've worked for a public company since, and I would say Brightroll was buttoned up as much, if not better, in a lot of areas. And you know, when a company is starting to think about acquisitions of that size, all these factors start coming into play, and all these constituents start weighing in on, you know, the chief accounting officer doesn't want to take on a mess, and they can a deal. And so you really wanted to make sure that everything that finance could do was put your best foot forward before the deal was even considered. During the deal, if we wanted to run scenarios on any aspect of our business, we were able to do it in minutes because of the systems we put in place. We uploaded, and LT is here. She was a key part of the deal team. 10,000 documents in 72 hours up to a data room. Like, Marissa, we didn't know if Marissa was going to walk away. I'll be completely honest. And that was our big concern during the deal. We got an offer from Yahoo, but you know how these things go. You know, the process can drag on a month, and then they get cold feet, and they don't acquire you. We wanted to make sure they had absolutely everything as quickly as possible, as organized as possible. There would be no excuse that it was a diligence issue. And that was G&A's responsibility. And, you know, I feel like we did about as good a job as could humanly be done. But we had prepared for this starting back 4 years. You know, and we had really focused on how do we get things organized, how do we get data clean, how do we get the right people. We were able to keep the team that interfaced with Yahoo down to, what was it, 3, 4 on G&A, that's it, all the way through term sheet. Nobody at the company knew about it until there was a leak. And then everyone knew. But we went 2 months not having to talk to a single person in the organization that wasn't on the deal team about any topic, because we were able to just provide absolutely everything they needed because G&A was so organized. You know, and I think that if I think about, like, all right, what's your measure of success? That's a pretty good one. So with that, happy to answer questions or go to lunch, whatever you want.
I would say real quick to Ron's point, there's no way we would have been able to get there if all we were doing was transactions. Like, if there wasn't a plan on what we put in place, what data should we start tracking, what data should we start using, what data is actually telling us whether we're going off the rails or not, we would have never been able to get to this spot. let alone do it with a small deal team or in a short amount of time or anything like that. So it definitely really is focusing on, like, if you're getting A players on board, let those A players do what they're best at, and what they're best at isn't going to be just running the hamster wheel.
Yep.
As startups scale, G&A is not necessarily the one place that people want to put money. And it's definitely the core foundation based on. Is there a metric or a rule of thumb that you use for kind of G&A to non-G&A type functions?
You know, I think there are pain points that businesses start hitting that are only going to be solved by G&A. I think that's what happened at Brightroll. We got to a point on invoicing, on collections, on everything from legal to other areas, and you kind of have to use a crisis to get G&A funded, has been my philosophy. It's unfortunate, but depending on the stage of the company, I can't say that's a terrible allocation of resources. You try to be smart. I mean, a lot of the software, if I had to choose between hiring yet another transactional individual for $75,000 here in the Bay Area versus waiting a bit and then hiring someone better, I always hired someone better. And I pushed off the more junior hires because I just felt like we were just throwing bodies at problems if we went down that path. And so, I think that it definitely helped that we had a CFO fairly early on, and because if you're expecting a CEO who has 1 million mouths to feed, right? I want to make sure my product's right. I want to make sure my sales team has got what they need, my product fit, my go-to-market, all that stuff. It's very difficult. And you kind of need the board to chime in as well and say, what you need is by looking at some of these signals. Like I look at a board deck and I can tell you flat out who has a tight running G&A team and who doesn't. Right? I can just usually look at the data that's in there and how robust it is and whether numbers tie between pages. And I can tell pretty quickly, like, you probably need to work on that. And so, I think some of that is unfortunately a first-time CEO lessons learned. And I think that once you've been down that path once, you realize, what a better, and it's not like our finance team was ridiculously sized. I think that if anything, we were always the last team to ask for anything, partially because we realized there was so much low-hanging fruit, and partially because we hired people who I think, had some kind of vision of what they wanted and picked their spots before they asked for resourcing. And so, Vito and I worked hard. The first year of Brightroll was a lot of 80 to 100-hour weeks, getting a lot of this set up. But then we felt we had credibility to ask for more from the organization because we kind of made our bones.
Yeah, I would say Ron and I would never say 50% G&A is like the way you should go in a startup, right? I think what we do want to bring up the point, though, is that there's so much stuff that's probably done by other organizations and departments. So like sales quota, let's say. That's being distributed against other departments, and it's wasting their time or taking up more of their time that could be focused on actually what they're being hired to do, right? So by having a kind of a central G&A function that can really focus on that and drive that, you get a lot more leverage from that than you would expect off of, oh, do I need another G&A hire? I can hire another salesperson. But that next salesperson is probably going to be bogged down by all this extra like minutia and overhead that we haven't really planned for yet.
Other questions? All right, off to lunch. Thanks, everyone.